The 2000s was somewhat of a golden era for Aussie cars. Holden and HSV were producing a wide variety of performance cars, as were Ford and FPV in both straight 6 and V8 form. And I am lucky enough to be driving one from that era. Now, if you've seen the last couple of videos, you might remember I drove a very rare HSV Coupe 4. Well, what I'm driving today is the car in which it was based on, the Holden Monaro, both owned by the same owner, who I'm very grateful for letting me drive both of them. Now, this one that I'm driving is the Series 2 in what's probably its most loved colour, Devil Yellow. For the non-Aussies, this wasn't Australia's first attempt at a two-door muscle car. The Monaro name had been out for a pretty long time, first introduced in 1968 with the Monaro HK. It had a few engine options, but the range-topping GTS had the 327 V8. Later on, the HT and the HG followed, and then through the 70s was the HQ, HJ, and HX. There was an HZ that followed, although this one broke tradition and became a four-door, and it was simply sold as the Holden GTS, as the Monaro name had been dropped by that point. But the Monaro made a return in 2001 with the V2 Holden Monaro, based on the VX Commodore. It came with a couple of engine options, a 3.8 Ecotec V6, which was supercharged, and that came with a 4-speed auto, or the 5.7 LS1 with both auto and manual options. These were available in the US as a Pontiac GTO and the UK as a Vauxhall Monaro. In 2003, the Series 2 came out, which is this one. A couple of changes came with it. The interior was now based on a VY Commodore. It had different 18-inch alloy rims, and the V6 variant was now dropped because it really wasn't selling that well at all. About one V6 was sold for every 10 V8s. It also had a little bit of extra power, about 13 horsepower or 10 kilowatts or so, thanks to a redesigned exhaust. Now, after the Series 2, the VZ-based Series 3 came out with some cosmetic changes like a new bonnet, and about 20 horsepower more thanks to a dual exhaust. Matter of fact, in 2002, Peter Brock drove one of these at the Targa Tasmania. Now, like I said, the Series 2 that I'm driving had the VY-based interior, and honestly, from a company that was never exactly known for having German levels of luxury, it's honestly not that bad in here. It's got electrically adjustable leather seats, a 10-speaker stereo with twin subwoofers, and the actual build quality seems pretty solid. Same with the Coupe 4, the air conditioning is actually excellent. It gets very, very cold in here very quickly. And it's very well sound deadened because not much road or tyre noise gets through at all. I'm not a fan of this massive steering wheel though. This, like I said, is the LS1, so this has 315 horsepower and about 460 newton meters of torque. Peak power is pretty low, it comes in at about 5,200 RPM, so it's a very lazy setup drivetrain. The gearbox, that's a very similar one to what was in the HSV Coupe 4 that I drove a couple of months ago. It is a tiny little bit different, obviously, because it's a rear-wheel drive unit, not an all-wheel drive. And to me, the biggest drawback of the HSV was that gearbox. It is ultimately the same in the way in which it operates. It is good at comfort-focused driving in the sense that we are cruising along at 1,500 RPM at 90k an hour. So it's a very lazy drivetrain, which in its own respect is at least somewhat appealing for this sort of GT-focused driving. But the characteristics of the gearbox, yeah, they're sluggish. I mean, changing down, if you put the foot down a little bit now it changes and it's on its way. It's not an engine that loves to rev, definitely. The rev limit is pretty low. It's about 6,000 odd RPM that the limiter cuts in. It's a car that rolling acceleration-wise feels more satisfying than off-the-line performance. Suspension out on the road, yeah, naturally it's an Aussie car, so it does feel very well adapted to these sorts of open roads that aren't perfect. They look good on camera, but there are plenty of little imperfections that you go over. It feels supple enough that it's comfortable, but it definitely doesn't float along the road. It's a very nice balance, actually, of refinement. I am quite impressed with how balanced they got the suspension tuning. The gauge cluster is also very yellow, which is optional with this colour. And I've never been fond of yellow cars, but this yellow seems to just work. All right, let's put our foot down a little bit. We have put the gearbox into power shift mode. Yeah, good throttle response. Very smooth. Kind of feels like when you're in an airliner and you're taking off, it's that sort of progressive torque that pushes you all the way up until the rev limit. I think could definitely do with a tasteful exhaust just to bring out a little bit more engine character. The ratios are quite long being a 4-speed. I think a 5-speed would be a little bit nicer, especially in this era. It's a modern enough car. Other manufacturers were using 5-speeds. Some Germans even using 6-speeds. So yeah, this car needs a manual. The gearbox is a letdown. Despite not necessarily being marketed as a GT car, this car is very suited for GT work. So now we are on a slightly more demanding little bit of road, and what might be outside of this car's comfort zone slightly, but let's find out. Well, like I said, I promised I wouldn't make this a comparison with a HSV Coupe 4, but it definitely feels more nimble. It's lighter by a little bit over 100 kilos. This weighs in at about 1.6 ton. Now, one thing that does interest me is the VY Commodore SS had firmer suspension tuning than this does, which is interesting. And for what the car was maybe trying to achieve in sort of the muscle car context, maybe not necessarily the most appropriate, but this road here should test that out. Steering, not a lot of feel, not particularly sharp, but somewhat linear. The Series 2 Monaros did have a slightly different tuned steering rack and slightly thicker roll bars compared to the Commodores. The steering wheel though is too big. It needs to be smaller for more spirited driving. Very planted, 235 section tyres, so there's plenty of grip on offer. These ones are Pirellis. So body roll is relatively well contained. I am somewhat aware of it, however, there's enough grip on offer. It doesn't corner with poise per se, it's planted, there's grip, would like a smaller steering wheel, and then you can power out of corners, wait for the gearbox to do its thing. Even in power shift mode, it still feels like your right foot and the gearbox down changing occur in 2 separate time zones. But when it finally does pick up a gear, yeah, you can really ride the torque out of a corner. This car has slightly, it's the only sort of aftermarket thing on this car, it's got brakes from a VZ or Series 3 Monaro, which are a little bit bigger. They are pretty confidence inspiring. They definitely don't feel under-braked at all. I think the suspension being softer than it is in the SS, it doesn't feel ridiculously detrimental, but I think if it was well damped and well rebanded, it could definitely be a little bit firmer. I'm not entirely sure why they went down that route of making it a bit softer, to be honest. You think a 2-door sports car, the sedan would be a bit softer, but that's the logic that they applied. But really though, this car is flowy. So it's not a corner hunter 997, so it's still somewhat satisfying on more open bit of road than, you know, tight hairpin corners, for example. Now let's get on the power a little bit again here. Yeah, just torque, so much of it. But I like it. So far, the 2 Holden and HSV I've driven on the channel, I've loved. They do have an element of character, definitely. They're not particularly flamboyant, well, at least from this generation. I'm sure the modern HSV, you know, with the final GTSRs would be very different, but it feels somewhat isolated in terms of feel, but there's just something about the tuning and the way it drives, the comfort, the suspension, how quiet it is. From car manufacturers that were never renowned for being super luxurious. But yeah, I'm very keen to drive more Aussie cars because there's something they've got a sense of charm to them, and now exclusivity because we don't make them anymore. So if you have anything Australian that may be of interest, please do reach out, send me an email. I don't subscribe to this Holden versus Ford. I honestly couldn't care. I like them both. But yeah, this is a very, very nice car on the open road, other than the gearbox. Other than that, it is very good. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Reach out if you would like to see your car featured on the channel. And yeah, thanks for watching and see you for the next one.